When I was younger, I decided to treat myself to a vacation on a cruise ship. I was at cabin number 105. Since there was only one bed in each bunk, I had to share the cabin with another guest. While I didn't get to know my roommate very well, I did see his bag resting next to the wardrobe. While the cabin was on the tiny side, the bed was rather pleasant. The awful smell of mustiness that pervaded the room was the only thing I found weird about the situation. I was exhausted on that particular night when we set sail, so I decided to get an early start on my sleep and choose the lower berth. I was startled awake in the middle of the night by a rather loud commotion. I woke up with a start when I heard a sigh coming from the bed above me. As I had been sleeping, I thought that my roommate had entered the cabin while I was still asleep. In the gloom, I couldn't make out anything at all. Once I heard him open the door, I followed the sound of his footsteps down the hallway. He walked out, leaving the door open behind him, and the motion of the ship caused it to swing open and shut on its hinges. I got out of bed to turn it off, then fumbled my way back to my room in pitch black, and I went right back to sleep. The waves were rough when I got up in the morning, and the cruise liner was rocking from side to side as it traveled through the waves. The chamber retained its stale aroma of dampness, and the temperature was quite low. I needed to get up and close the porthole since it was propped open. Since the curtains on the top bunk were drawn, I believed that my roommate was still in bed. After getting ready, I headed to the observation deck. I griped to one of the stewards about how chilly and wet my cabin was when I finally located one of them. "Which cabin are you in?" he inquired of me. "Cabin 105, I answered. I saw a change in the steward's demeanor as soon as I mentioned the number. He trembled clearly and looked at me. "What is it? Anything wrong?" I queried. "Well, nothing," he fumbled a bit. "Just that. Every guest that stays in the cabin has voiced their complaints. There's something wrong with it. I'm not allowed to discuss it, so that's it. They do not want the passengers to be alarmed by us." "What are you referring to?" I inquired in shock. I felt quite inquisitive. The steward dropped his voice and peered behind him. He said, "I don't want to lose my job, but I felt you should know. All of the passengers who have slept in cabin 105 on the last 3 voyages have dived overboard." The steward then turned and left. I couldn't make up my mind whether I should trust him. The captain visited me when I was having breakfast. "Has your roommate been around?" he inquired. "No," I said. "Why?" The captain answered quietly. "He appears to have vanished. We're worried he might have jumped overboard." "He is the 4th, then," I said in excitement. The captain grew uneasy when he discovered I knew about the other 3. He scowled. "Don't tell the other tourists about this. We don't want to have to handle panic." After a long day, I got back to my cabin, and the first thing I did was open the curtains on the top bed. It had no people in it. When I considered that the guy who had slept there was most likely already dead, it gave me shivers. After taking off my clothes, I laid down on my bed to get some rest. I was startled awake again in the middle of the night by the sound of something slamming. It was Arctic cold outside. Once again, the porthole was propped wide open, and it was scraping against the surrounding wall. I got out of bed to shut the porthole, but as soon as I did, I was startled by the sound of movement on the top bunk, which was directly behind me. As I turned around to look, though, it was impossible to make out anything in the darkness. Eventually, I became aware of a muffled moan, and my blood almost stopped moving through my veins. There was something present. I forced myself to face my phobia and raced across the room to the top bed, where I opened the curtains and felt around inside. To my utter terror, my palms detected the presence of anything there. Something dripping wet and bone, chillingly cold. Something that reeked terribly of seaweed that had gone bad. The thing came at me out of nowhere all of a sudden. It was similar to a thick mass of slime, one that was heavy and damp, yet highly resilient. I took a step backward, and in that split second, the door opened and the object sped through. I ran out after it, but the hallway was poorly lighted, and I couldn't make out anything in that area of the building. I hurried back inside my cabin as soon as I realized how terrified I was and switched on all of the lights. The top bed was fully saturated in seawater, and the whole area smelled like decaying seaweed since it was surrounded by it. I couldn't calm down enough to go back to sleep, so I got some exercise and walked up to the balcony to get some fresh air and get my thoughts together. I attempted to inform the captain who was there of what had happened that evening. I said, "I've never felt more terrified in my whole life. I believe my cabin to be haunted." The captain said, "Nonsense. To show you, I'll spend tomorrow night in the same cabin as you. We'll then see what occurs. There must be a logical reason, I'm sure." The skipper arrived outside my cabin the next evening. He locked the door once we entered. "Nothing can now enter or exit," he said. To make sure the cabin was vacant, we searched it. I perched on the edge of the bottom bed while the captain took a seat on a chair in front of the door. He offered me a drink after bringing out a bottle of whiskey. He said, "The first time it occurred was a month ago. This cabin's last occupant was a mental patient. He purchased a ticket for this cruise ship after making his way out of the insane institution. Maybe he had intended to commit suicide. Who knows what passes through these nuts' minds? He hurled himself overboard in the dead of night." He suddenly stopped and paused to look through the porthole. I did the same thing. The bolt that kept it shut seemed to be slowly rotating. We both shrieked. The lights went out all at once. The porthole crashed open as the cruise liner rocked against the waves. The upper bunk's curtains moved back and forth. The captain let out a loud yell of astonishment as he sprang to his feet. I could see him fumbling with something in the shadows. "The top bunk has something in it," he yelled. I extended my hand in an attempt to assist him, but my fingers clasped on something horrifying. Something that was so awful that it was beyond description. Anything that smelled like rotten seaweed and old seawater altogether. It was a pale, bloated body of a guy who had drowned, and it was a hideous creature that oozed and slid all over the place. I could see the whites of his dead eyes staring at me from the shadows, and its lifeless face was contorted into a horrific grimace. The horrible creature grabbed me by the neck and started suffocating the life out of me as soon as it could. That was so powerful that I couldn't stand up to it any longer. It was difficult for me to take a breath. I screamed, and it let me go once I did. The creature sprang over me and hurled itself on the captain, causing him to stumble backward while letting out a horrified scream. The monster stopped moving for a split second as it was crawling over him, and then it escaped out of the porthole. After assisting the captain in getting to his feet, we both struggled to exit the cabin together. After an hour, several members of the crew of the ship were seen nailing boards over the door of the cabin. The cabin has been sealed up for as long as anybody can remember, and no guest has ever been permitted to spend the night there again. To the best of my knowledge, cabin 105 still remains haunted by the ghastly apparition of a deceived entity.